Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for some of you. I'm Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's Fireside chat. This will be a really cool conversation. I think we've got some a great topic, and I know we've got great questions planned already. So I'm definitely excited to see how this conversation goes. Before we get started, we have just a reminder that you are going to get a recording of today's presentation. It will come to you directly from GoToWebinar, so be on the lookout for that. You'll get that tomorrow afternoon. Also, we'd like you to type in your questions. I know they're going to come up throughout the session, so please type those in the chat whenever you have them, and we'll get to as many as we can today. And if we can't get to them, I'll send them off to Jarian and Sean, and we'll see if we can get answers for you later. But do type those in. All right, so with us, we have Sean Donahue. He's the Senior Solutions Marketing Manager at Nutanix. And we also have Jarian Gibson. He's a Staff Solutions Architect in the EUC space. He's also a CTP and the Kansas City Metro CUGC leader. So hello, Sean and Jarian.
Hey, Stephanie.
Hello.
And also we have with us today Mike Streetz. He is a CTP and LA CUGC leader. Mike is going to keep an eye on all the questions that you type into the chat for us and bring those up and help moderate that discussion later on. So hello, Mike. Thanks for being here.
Hey, how you doing?
All right, well, I am going to turn things right over to Sean and Jarian to get started. And while they're getting started, I'm going to put some polls out for you guys. So fill those out, and here you go. I'm going to disappear. Bye.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's so great to be here, and I am super excited to be joined by, let's say, the Tom Brady of end user compute. Although, Jarian, I'm not sure that that's as much of a compliment this year as it was in years past. Maybe, I don't know, let's just refer to you as the GOAT of end user compute. Is that good enough without bringing Tom's name into it?
I wouldn't go that far, but it's a great compliment, so thank you.
And we also want to talk today, there are some poll questions up if you want to answer those. Just some light touch poll questions, nothing too stressful, nothing too strenuous for our viewers to participate in as far as what your current hypervisor du jour. But we're talking today, Jarian, one of my favorite subjects, which has been coming up, which is this Nutanix validated design, but it's also a Citrix validated design. So it's an NVD and a CVD. And I was kind of hoping you'd let's start off by clarifying that. How does Nutanix and Citrix have a validated design simultaneously?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So what we did was we took our data that we have, all the great data that we put in our performance testing from our reference architecture guides, which is more of a reference architecture, performance testing, kind of all down in the details of performance and so forth. We took that and we combined that with our best practices guides we have there as well, along with a single place to have your bill of materials, not only for the hardware, but also for services, should you choose to include services as well in your deployment. So it's kind of a combined one-stop document for deploying Citrix DaaS on Nutanix AHV.
Okay. And it's a prescriptive guidance, isn't it? Going actually through what was done more than just, so kind of the reference architecture to the validated design is the drawing board to actually putting it into practice. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yes, it's prescriptive, but it's like a prescription, depending on, what kind of prescription and if they're generics and that kind of stuff, you have some options there in NVD. So you don't have to follow it to the law of the letter. There are some flexibility in the document as well.
Yeah, so my prescription says take 1 pill a day, but I take 3, and that's the flexibility that you have. No, I'm just kidding, doctor. I'm kidding. But what about, so Nutanix does validated design, and then Citrix validates it as well. And it's not just a marketing stamp, I assume, is it?
No, it's more of saying that, just like anything else we do for whether it's NC2 with Citrix, whether it's AHV, whether it's, the Citrix NetScaler on Nutanix, they test it, they review it, make sure that it meets their stamp of approval. And so we get that stamp on there. So the way the process went was, we, other teams in the environment who are doing, or on the team who are doing the validate designs, the hybrid cloud one, the multi-cloud one, and so forth. That was kind of our base to work from. And they said, here you go, this is what our validated designs are, turn this into a Citrix validated design. So from there, we took all of our testing, we took all our best practices, we put some different variances in there, because if you've looked at our reference architecture guides, we usually have 4 flavors per release, right? So we usually have Windows 10, which includes MCS and PVS, Windows Server OS, which also includes MCS and PVS as well. So you take those 4 documents and put them into one, and that's where that variance comes from, of OS, profile type, and so forth. So then over to Citrix, they reviewed it, came back with some questions, had some collaboration there, and they stamped that as Citrix ready.
Yeah, but they actually vet it and test it, and they actually do some work behind it, and they review the whole design doc before they even bless it. So it's not the marketing rubber stamp type of approval. It's got some veritas. Yep. or gravitas. Veritas, where did that come from?
You want some backups?
Some gravitas behind the actual Citrix ready stamp. But so that leads me to the question, as from a Nutanix perspective in the NVD, what Nutanix components are in the NVD? And by the way, if you're tuning into this, the NVD is accessible, or available, I should say. Nutanix.com has it, but then of course Citrix Ready also has the validated design too. So you have 2 places that you can get it. It is the same validated design, and at last count, it was 64 pages of chock full of goodness to it. So that's in reading it, I wanted to understand better about what are the Nutanix components in the NVD.
Yeah, so we're starting with AOS as the foundation. The hypervisor is going to be AHV, our own hypervisor. And then from there, we have services on there like Nutanix files for your profile storage, and we have the option of deploying Prism Central as well. We don't dive too deep in Prism Central, because today, from a Citrix integration standpoint with AHV, you don't necessarily need Prism Central. That is changing, but today you don't need it. But there's one component in there that you might need it for, and that's depending on what licensing you picked. So traditionally, we have our capacity-based licensing, or CBL, that's more based on your compute in your cluster. If you have that model, you don't have to deploy Prism Central unless you want to for some advanced functionality. But if you go with our new VDI per user licensing, that does require Prism Central, so you have to deploy Prism Central there. Expanding that out, we do have 2 clusters in there, one for management components, and then one for the workload components.
Okay. And I noticed you did reference Nutanix files in there for profile management. In the validated design, are there references to FS logics in there?
Yeah, so if you look at all of our more recent reference architecture guides, they do standardize using FS logics. And we show that on a hybrid workload cluster, meaning you have your workloads for Citrix and also files deployed on the same cluster. We also have data that also shows it being on a dedicated cluster. In this NVD, it's a hybrid workload cluster, so it has files and the Citrix workloads deployed on the same cluster.
Gotcha. And you also referenced, and it's a topic for another day, I understand, we won't get into it here today, but the updates to the licensing model traditionally capacity-based to now the licensing model falling more in line with the traditional or the Citrix licensing model of a concurrent user idea. So that's a great subject, and maybe we could convince the CUGC team to have us back to talk about that.
Yeah, just the biggest note there is that with the user-based, you have more flexibility. For example, disaster recovery is included. If you want to use disaster recovery on our Nutanix cloud clusters, whether that's AWS or Azure, you have to have the ultimate license for that, but it does give you some flexibility and help you cover DR as well.
Yeah, which is a huge subject today. DR, BC, bursting up to the cloud for that. It is just occupying a lot of cycles, let's say, just talking about evangelizing and designing it out. So, but now I'm getting off track, and I wanted to get back to it. We talked about the Nutanix components that are in the NVD, but of course, a big part of the validated design is Citrix. So what Citrix components are in the NVD, and are we using the new Citrix terms? Because Citrix is no stranger to renaming their products.
Yeah, so we are using Citrix DaaS, formerly known as Virtual Apps and Desktop Service. So we are using Citrix DaaS as the control plane. From there, we have the cloud connectors deployed on the infrastructure server. And then depending which model you want to use for your workload provisioning, we also have the option to deploy Citrix provisioning on the workload cluster as well. Of course, if you go with the provisioning piece, you have to deploy licensing for Citrix also on there, so that's there as well. But yeah, those are the main components. Citrix Cloud makes it easy. Where with all the control plane components, so it kind of slimmed down on the required infrastructure components on the cluster.
Mm. And is it still referred to as Citrix Cloud, or did they change that to fall under the Citrix DaaS umbrella as well?
That's a good question. I still call them both. I think Cloud's the overarching umbrella, and DaaS is just the service piece.
Yeah, and so Jarian mentions also that Citrix DaaS, formerly known as Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops, formerly known as Citrix Zen App and Zen Desktop. So here's my trivia question for everybody on the line here, and I think you can type it into the chat. There's no points, no prizes, points mean nothing. But what version of Citrix did you start with way back in the day? And actually, Jerry, and I'll throw that to you. What was the name of Citrix back in that day when you started?
I originally started with MetaFrame 1.8. I tested it on NT, and I was like, you know what? I want to get into group policy and use all the new Active Directory stuff. So I actually, when I went to deploy it, it was on Windows 2000.
Nice. Okay. And what was the workload that you deployed? Or what was the OS that you would deploy?
Yeah, so it was multi-user, Windows 2000, so RDSH based, and it was mainly for remote workers in the field, spread out in the country. Yeah.
I started with WinView, and the biggest excitement that I had was deploy, and it was Windows, so it was Windows NT 351, I think. And the biggest kick I got was deploying the graphical interface, but to a DOS operating system. Had no Windows installed on it, but I was running Windows on it. That was a big kick to me. So, okay, so we got the Nutanix components, we got the Citrix components, and then it's a validated design, and it goes through what you did to stand the environment up. But what kind of flexibility do I have in following the validation or the design?
Yeah, so let's start with kind of the base of the flexibility. So hardware, right? So all of our testing that we usually do, unless it's AMD-based hardware, is on our Nutanix NX-based node. So this document being Intel-based on our G8 hardware is on our Intel NX-based nodes. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go pick out your vendor flavor of choice. We are a software company, and it's very stated clearly in the document that you can use whatever hardware vendor that our software supports as long as the specs of that hardware are the same or better than what's in the document. So for example, if you're an HPE shop, deploy HPE, Cisco, deploy Cisco, Fujitsu, Dell, Lenovo, etc. You do have your choice of hardware. Just remember that, your mileage could vary if you don't deploy similar hardware specs.
Gotcha. And in that flexibility, what about GPUs? If I want to flirt around with NVIDIA GPUs, do I have that flexibility?
Today, GPUs are not in the document, but we are going to have an update. There are 2 updates coming. One I'm currently working on, and then the update after that, we will have a Trader desktop option in there, which will have GPUs for that as well. But you can also possibly deploy GPUs with this. Just know that just watch your density, because obviously you're bound by what the cards can do as far as profiles, depending on what profile you pick. It's not as with the A series cards, it's a lot better density wise per node than it used to be, but it will still vary depending on what profile you pick for the users.
Gotcha. And I did see a recent blog by a guy named Lee Caswell on the A16 performance, and that might be an interesting read for some people. I am looking at the chat. Some people did type in their first versions of Citrix, and we've got MetaFrame 4.5, Presentation Server 4.5, MetaFrame XP. There's another WinFrame person out there, MetaFrame 1.8. That was kind of when they started going mainstream, I think, MetaFrame 1.8, and then XenApp and XenApp 5. So we've got some good history behind us, or on our line today. This question. Go ahead.
Let's go back to the flexibility too as well. So I addressed the hardware piece. We also have 3 profiles in there. We have a like a task worker knowledge worker based profile for Windows 10. We have a more power user type profile in there for Windows 10, and then we have the heavier usage, the multi-user Windows Server OS profile as well. So you can deploy 3 different profile types. We also give you the flexibility of picking your provisioning type, whether you're an MCS, whether you're Team MCS or Team PVS, you have the option to deploy either.
And that actually, I'm going to skip around in my questions here, because we're unscripted, no rules, no laws, no scripts, no slides, no rules. That's how I like to do these presentations. And this one is, now it's just your opinion and nobody's going to hold it against you, but are you Team MCS or are you Team PVS?
I'm a team flexibility, but with that being said, because we fully support both and we have customers of all sizes doing both options. With that being said, I cut my teeth on PVS, so I grew up a PVS kid, but in more recent years, especially with hyperconvergence and Nutanix and just the things that we can do in our software stack with shadow clones and so forth, and the simplicity of it, I am Team MCS. And people always say, what about provisioning times, and what about multiple clusters and moving the image around as well, and that kind of stuff? Well, I got a couple things for you on that one. If you look at our technology with shadow clones, as far as boot times and redeploying the images, we actually cut down that time right there with that. Previously, when it came to moving the image around, we did things like protection policies or protection domains. Recently in AHV, what we did is released a function called AHV templates. And we have a PC plugin that is in the final stages that will take advantage of AHV templates in Prism Central, to where you can deploy an image from Prism Central to multiple clusters underneath that Prism Central instance. So that helps you with the moving that image around easily. And stay tuned, because we're always improving our integrations with Citrix as well.
Yeah, so I think we need to get that. Somebody get that nickname printed on a t-shirt for Jarian. It was the PVS kit. I love that. I think we should definitely go with that, that's for sure. And you mentioned boot times. You didn't mention boot storms, though. Are we doing anything to alleviate that with shadow clones?
Yeah, that helps there as well, because one of the key things of shadow clones and data locality is that all the reads and writes are local to the node the desktops are running on. So when you get to other hyper-converged, unoptimized vendors, you know, they may not be able to have, they don't have that technology. So what happens in that scenario is that you see that base image, that disk on one node in the cluster, which can create a hotspot on that storage. What it can also do is create unnecessary traffic to that node as well, and that's where you can get into some performance and scaling issues, boot times, image deployments, refreshing the disk, and so forth, logon times as well when using MCS on non-Nutanix deployments.
Gotcha. Now, one of the things I love to do, is that how I want to say this or phrase this, and I tell everybody on the teams here to do as well, is when you go to, because VDI in a medical scenario is very popular, and it's almost guaranteed that they're running some flavor of VDI, but when you go into the clinician office and they log into their EHR session, the medical record session, either count the seconds from when you see the Citrix splash screen till they're able to access your medical record, or does the clinician naturally turn around once they launch the session and start taking your blood pressure, temperature, checking your ears, and they have all the time to do all of that before they can get to their session? You know that their session isn't performing as well as it should be. Jarian, I got an interesting question here. As you were making and doing all the work behind the NVD, and obviously this is not a light lift. This is an exhaustive document, and it was a lot of work behind it. During that, is there anything that kind of surprised you, and it was, positively or even conversely, that surprised you during the creation of the NVD?
I think, the biggest thing was just, seeing the data as we've gotten, bigger, faster, better hardware, that our density continues to increase. So a lot of the time now, it's not as much as a density discussion, especially when you get into G8 hardware and look at the AMD processors as well. It's not more as much as the density discussion. It's more as the failure domain conversation. How many eggs do I want to put into one basket being a node, and if something happens to that node, what's my tolerance for those sessions being lost and having to reconnect to another session? So the performance, just the process here, with working with the NVD, it's a team effort. It's a total team effort from myself to Case to Sven, who's doing a lot of the performance testing, and then just to our other teams like services and so forth doing the review. Me being on the engineering side, I don't see how much that that they have to think about as far as building out that services side to provide services to customers. So seeing that aspect of it was interesting as well.
Yeah. And you said something that kind of fired a neuron off in my head, which was in the NVD itself, and I know it was well documented in there, but if we're looking at Citrix DaaS, and one of the components in there is the cloud connectors, and how many cloud connectors did we use in the NVD CVD, the validated design?
So we deployed 2 cloud connectors, and if you want HA doing cloud connector updates, because we all know with Citrix Cloud, those cloud connectors are pretty much evergreen, so they get updated as when there's new versions and so forth. So we use 2. If you want HA during upgrade operations, because they get upgraded in a rolling fashion, you can deploy 3. And then sizing those will depend on the number of sessions and workloads and so forth. And once you start scaling that NVD out to multiple workload clusters and pods and so forth, that's when you might want to look at deploying, either scaling up the cloud connectors or scaling out to more cloud connectors.
Gotcha. And Citrix recommendation on cloud connectors is still at least 2, right?
At least 2. Yep. Yeah, you got a nice warning in the console. If you only have 1, you'll see it every time. So
it's like when I start my car, the dashboard lights up like a Christmas tree with all the warning lights. In reading the NVD, and actually Mike Streetz, our user group monitor here. He says he used to be team PVS all the way, but MCS is so fast to deploy on AHV that you really used to have a good reason to go PVS these days. That's really well put. I like that.
Yes,
Very,
I 100% agree.
Yep. Thank you, Mike.
There is a quick question in the chat just around MCSAO on Nutanix. I've tried to answer it myself, but Jarian, if you can speak to this, is there any point in turning on MCSAO if you're using AHV?
No, there's actually not even the option to use it when you use the MCS wizard. There's no option for RAM cache or anything for MCSIO. You can install it when you install the VDA, but it's not going to do anything for you. The reason being is that with our distributed storage fabric, our software, we are already caching from RAM to solid state disk to spinning disk. So we already have that stuff built in. And when you use MCS, IO, which you can use if you use vSphere on Nutanix, because that option is there in the wizard. It's not in AHV. What happens is that the way that MCS IO destages from RAM to disk, it bypasses all of our storage optimizations I talked about, from our tiering to our cache and everything like that. So it actually is not really a benefit to you, and in some cases it can actually be deterrent for you. So that's why it's not needed. It's all built into our stack already, and it's already optimized for that in our stack.
Now, if you're just looking for an easy way to add a persistent disk, what would you recommend there?
For MCS?
Yeah.
So I'll tell you a secret. It's not supported, but the plugin actually does not throw away the persistent disk if it's in the image, if you deploy the desktop, right? It's not supported, but it's there to today. The other option too is we have what's called playbooks or XPlay in Prism Central, where you can do kind of if this then that, and you can actually add that too through that. And I recently did a POC for a customer where they wanted the write cache disk in PVS thrown away every time the machine booted. So basically what I did is I had a formatted disk inside of our image service. When that machine booted, it would, through REST APIs, through our playbook I created, it would attach the disk. That way it's at boot. That way it's there before Windows got there, before PVS came up, so the write cache could write to that disk. And then every time that machine rebooted, it deleted that disk as well and threw it away. So that was more of like they had a requirement for a security thing that no data be left over on the endpoint. That same style of runbook, whether you want to throw it away or not, the disk for security reasons, that same playbook can also be used, and that is a supported fashion with MCS. The other option too you can also do is scripting after the fact. But since we know that through the plugin that it does hang out, we're working through to see what it takes to make sure that that's a validated and supported fashion in the future.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good question.
And I know our back is getting against the wall for time, but instead of ending with the marketing future updates for the NVD question, what I wanted to know is, in reading the design, how important is the network design when we were discussing redundancy in it?
Yeah, the biggest thing there is that, in this NVD, including the networking, we're not having single points of failure, right? Because you don't want a single point of failure component taking your environment down. And that includes networking. So with the networking, there's always two links, redundant switches, top of rack switching, and so forth. That way, if you happen to lose a link, you still have the other link to go out from, and it's not causing some kind of outage.
Yeah. But it's not like an entire mesh network then?
We do have our spine leaf network and so forth, so that is there. So we do have redundant components built in, so we pretty much be covered there from a networking disaster, unless you lost the whole data center, which that's where in our future update, since you mentioned that, our future update will be going to hybrid multi-cloud with this. So it will cover disaster recovery, it will cover bursting, it will cover using Nutanix cloud clusters for landing points for those type of scenarios.
Okay. And that kind of feeds into that, what's going to have to be the last question is, What is plan? What are the future updates? You mentioned a few along the way, but let's wrap them all up in a bow for these validated designs.
Yep, the more quick one is just gonna be minor updates and just some things in there. Like for example, one piece I didn't clarify the write cache for PVS, which with Nutanix for the write cache, we always recommend using straight to disk. Or if once that goes away from the UI, you can use RAM cache with disk failover, but set the RAM cache to 0. So it goes right to the disk for the PVS RAM cache. So that context will be added. There's some other minor updates in there for the release that's coming out here pretty quickly. The next one will be a trader desktop. So GPU was mentioned, some feedback and input we have from Citrix. We are going to put a trader desktop profile into the NVD. And then after that, which probably will be more closer to the end of this year, early, because we're almost November now, so probably early next year, we'll have a big update. And that's what things we'll do, like, for example, when we do our testing, we do testing updates for Windows 10 versions, AHV versions, LTS versions for AHV, which, we're on an older one now. Also, too, if you notice, while we're using the Citrix Cloud Control Plane, we did standardize on the LTSR VDA, because we typically, with our testing, we standardize on LTSR releases for Citrix. That LTSR testing was done before 2203 dropped. So we'll update to the newest LTSR for Citrix, whether that's the base version or the CU. And then, like I said, we'll do things like Windows 10 updates to it, and then also add things like disaster recovery, multiple locations, hybrid multi-cloud, Nutanix cloud clusters, and AWS/Azure for expansion.
Gotcha. And that's in one of the, and now a word from our sponsor section. So the call to action, I'm going to bring Stephanie back in for this, because I believe we're out of time, but the call to action is to make sure you get to nutanix.com/Citrix. That's where you can get the validated design, as well as a lot of other things, including a test drive where you yourself can actually go through the motions and experience things like bursting 2,000 desktops up into a public cloud like AWS. And there's a great press release that I want to plug about the Nutanix cloud clusters on Microsoft Azure. And then there's a follow-up blog that you can read about Citrix having been the first validated workload on the Nutanix cloud clusters for Azure as well. But it all starts with nutanix.com/Citrix. And I tell you, I will do this every day, Stephanie, throw questions at Jarian. It's almost like, it reminds me of the old days of what were they called? Ask the experts, or we affectionately called them stump the chump, and see if we can trick somebody. But not Jarian. No way, baby. You can't throw him a curveball.
Before we go, Mike, are there any more questions out there from the chat that we haven't addressed?
Yeah, there is one question that came in.
What's that, Stephanie?
You do have more time, by the way. We usually book the hour, so.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a question that came in asking, how do the latest Intel CPUs compare to the latest AMD CPUs from a virtual apps and desktops perspective?
That's a great question, because at first when AMD dropped, they had just the high amount of cores, the high amount or the higher clock speeds as well. So you're looking at 64 core servers and so forth. So, that's where the whole density versus failure domain conversation came in. And so Intel was lagging behind, especially when you look at their Cascade Lake, our G7 nodes, the Cascade Lake, and even the G6 nodes before that. Now with Intel in our G8 nodes using the Ice Lake architecture, the gap is closing. AMD is still leading that because it's the high amount of cores they have, but Intel is starting to close the gap. So when you look at the new Ice Lake or our G8 nodes, or the vendor of your choice that has those architecture in it, they're definitely going to see a boost from that. And then we'll see what AMD does in their next generation of hardware as well.
Great, thank you. That's the, oh, there's another question that just popped through. What is the sweet spot on CPU RAM for Win11 VDIs on Nutanix?
So we're starting to see CPU-wise that, 3 vCPU is pretty much, kind of that good sweet spot, especially when you go from 2 vCPU to 3 vCPU, just for the fact that, when you add more CPUs to a desktop, your density is going to drop. While your density does drop on those nodes, you will get better response time. And the delta from 2 vCPU to 3 vCPU is really good. Once you start getting into 4 vCPU and 5 vCPU based VMs, the delta in density is really not worth the minor bump in application response time on it. So we're really seeing 3 being the sweet spot for that, and probably the best balance between density and the boost in application response time. Memory, you're looking, the 4 gig plus, we see some customers up in the 16 gig range, but usually that 4 to 8 gig range is probably going to be your starting spot, depending on what your application profiles and the workload looks like.
Cool. There's another question that's just popped up. Is NUMA something we still need to factor in when sizing VDAs?
You do, because you don't want to still outbound that limit. But again, with the advanced technology, the amount of cores, the increase in hardware we're getting, it's not as bad as it used to be from a hardware standpoint.
I was just trying to look up, because you said you were talking about scalability and how it plateaus off as far as the return when you throw more cores at it. It plateaus off into not giving you the return. So we all are familiar with Moore's law, the doubling of density and performance, and we adapt it to speed of the chip. But there's actually what you referred to as to the plateauing, given the more you throw at it. That's actually called Amdahl's argument. So there you go. There's your trivia bit for a Tuesday afternoon. The converse of Moore's law is Amdahl's argument. Any other questions out there?
That is all the ones that I'm seeing in the question box for now.
Let me ask this question to the audience. Has anyone on the call already reviewed the MVD and have gone through it? If you haven't, it's very easy to, well, Sean has. If you haven't, it's very easy to get to. Nutanix.com/architecture. Under the EUC section, you will see the validated design, and you can review it right there as well. Always happy to hear feedback or any questions or things that you might have from it. Because again, this is the first release of it, and while we do have updates planned, if there's like a blind spot in the document, we're always happy to take that feedback and address that.
There's another question coming in. Are we seeing any changes with public cloud workloads? For instance, more WVD Azure versus AWS?
So I do see them in my role, but I also see a lot shifting back from a public cloud to more of a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud model. And that's where I get a lot of conversations, especially when it comes to our cloud clusters product, because of the flexibility that it gives you, between multiple clouds. Also, you can more fine tune your profiles. You're not stuck to more of the rigid profiles that native cloud has. You can actually pick it. And then looking just at, the limits as far as number of VMs per, for example, if you're on native VMs in public cloud, the number of supported VMs per availability zone if you're doing MCS in the cloud, where, with us on cloud clusters, since they're bare metal nodes, you don't have that limitation. You're more limited by the density on the node itself, where you can deploy, multiple cloud cluster instances, bare metal nodes instances in the cloud with that. So you have more flexibility and more granularity there.
And just
Thanks.
as a side note, WVD is now called AVD,
Yep.
Azure Virtual. So Microsoft's no stranger to renaming products either.
I still slip and call it WVD sometimes too as well.
One question is, for multi-session VDA, do you have a general preference for sockets versus cores?
So actually, we have a good document on that on our portal. So my counterpart Sven did some great performance testing where whether it's one vCPU and 8 cores or 8 cores in one vCPU, or 8 vCPU and 1 core, there's not that much variance, whether it's a multi-session workload or a single session workload. And we have that, there's a document out there on our portal, Windows 10 performance analysis, I believe it's called, where it looks at that as far as core vCPU ratio. So we don't see a big difference. It's minor difference from the testing that we've done.
Is that setting mainly there for licensing then?
It can be for licensing, yes.
Yeah. Another question. Do you think the hybrid multi-cloud is due to cost? I've been hearing that companies are slowing down cloud workloads due to a cost perspective.
I think it's cost and flexibility. So think about your cloud journey story, right? You're on-prem on Hypervisor X today, you move to the cloud, going to native cloud, what's that journey look like? And then, think about your flexibility and your options there. It's funny because Case and I were on a call earlier, and one of the things that Case said was, the first thing I look at when I go to public cloud is, how do I get out? What's my exit strategy, right? Because if it doesn't work out, what's it going to, it's going to cost me to get in because I'm refactoring, retraining possibly. There's all these considerations to think about, but also too, that is going to go in reverse. If you need to go to cloud X or come back to on-prem, what is your exit strategy? So that's where we're seeing with higher multi-cloud is, especially with the solution with cloud clusters, is we're giving you that flexibility. And we're giving you that, easy portability as well, because with that, you can be on-prem today, move to Azure tomorrow, move to AWS the next day, or actually work concurrently between all 3 clouds without having to retrain, without having to refactor, and have a great time to value as well. Because again, it's just, with that, it's our software on bare metal nodes in the cloud. You're using our built-in things like protection policies, protection domains, templates functionality to push out that image to multiple clusters. And so your time to value and your entry and exit strategy from the cloud is minor at that point.
And do you think a lot of people are getting tripped up by moving workloads into the cloud, not realizing that the typical user behavior is not to shut down the workload or even to end the session, but they leave it up and running, burning that consumption, and that goes against what I thought I was going to get with cloud from a lower monthly bill.
Yep, and there's things like Citrix Autoscale that can help you with that, to help you make sure those things get shut down and usually get moved around. The other thing is too, whether it's us or anybody else, is application and data gravity as well. Where your application backends, where's your data going to live? Those things need to be thought out also, because you get those customers say, I'm going all in the cloud, but I have mainframes or other application backends that I can't move from on-prem, and my workload's out here in the cloud, and I'm not giving the best user experience to my user because of the latency, or just because of the way the application could work, having that distance between the back end and the front end.
The data proximity, I believe we're calling it. Yeah.
Any other questions, Mike?
There was something saying, quick to note, but cores sockets is important for DDCs and cloud connectors because SQL Express has limitations on cores/sockets.
Yep, licensing.
Yeah. So I think SQL Express is limited to the lesser of 1 socket or 4 cores.
Yeah, it's usually a software restriction, but performance-wise, there's not much difference there from our testing.
Yeah. There's another one. An Azure Escape Plan was part of the Citrix Cloud design. I listed several techs going to different Citrix Cloud providers, or go with Nutanix and place a small box in each of our 99 offices. Is that a question or a statement?
Because you can
Maybe.
still put, because if you're looking for, if it's a question, you can still place, boxes in local locations and still have an on-prem footprint. The nice thing is with the clusters, if you have a central data center, but you still want to have some kind of regional availability proximity for those users, you can deploy a cloud clusters instant, 3 nodes minimum, in a region / availability zone close to those locations if you want, proximity to regional availability for those users. So you have flexibility there.
And then anything else?
Nothing's come in, and I think all the outstanding questions are answered.
Stephanie, is it too much of a commitment to promise everybody an email after this? Everybody wants email.
No, we'll definitely send you an email because we're going to send you the link to the recording. And we'll also put the links that we shared in the chat today. Definitely will go out to you tomorrow afternoon.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to have some links in it that we might have mentioned during the panel, during the event itself, that nutanix.com /Citrix link, the architecture link that Jarian mentioned, and the link to the test drive at least. But then don't forget those Nutanix cloud clusters on Azure. That's the big one that came out 2 weeks ago at MS Ignite.
Yep.
In Seattle. So.
And that is already Citrix ready as well on that solution. So we had AWS for a couple of years now. And always when I did the clusters webinars for CUGC, I think I did AWS webinar a year and a half ago, I think. The 2 big questions that I got asked are answered now. One was Azure, we launched 2 weeks ago. The other was GPUs. So in AWS, we have the G4DN nodes that have 8 T4 cards in them. So if you're looking at cloud clusters and you want GPUs, you have the option AWS. If you were asking about Azure, you have the option now to use Azure as well.
There you go.
All right, well, I just have a couple of wrap-up announcements if you think we're done. I think that the questions have stopped. So I want to thank you both.
There's one question that just popped through.
Okay.
You prompted somebody to get it out at the last minute. Is Nutanix file supported on NC2 yet?
Yes, it is. So it is supported today on AWS, and we have it planned for NC2 in Azure. So you can do it today. I'm actually working on a demo that shows profiles on-prem and going to AWS as well, both using files and using Cloud Cache. That's all out there, all supported. So you can do that today on AWS, and it's planned for Azure.
Cool. I guess that's the last question.
Yeah, and if you want to know more about, if you want to know more about Azure, Stephanie, I believe we have a webinar in December, I think, for NC2, and I'll have updates on Azure then as well.
Yep.
What about files in XI?
Files where?
G? XI?
Oh, and Xi. So Xi, which was our DR as a service offering, the original name of it. So now it's called Nutanix DR as a service. That is also planned for DR as a service, formerly known as Xi.
Cool.
That would have been a good poll question. How many people in the audience running VDI with Nutanix files? I would have been curious on that one. Next time. Okay, Stephanie, now try your wrap-up items. Questions are closing in 3, 2, going once, going twice. Sold to the man in the Windows 95 sweater.
Thank you for moderating, Mike.
Yeah, no worries.
All right, thanks you guys. I really appreciate you being on here today. And And for those of you who may have opted in for a chance to win the Amazon gift card, I will do that drawing as soon as we close this out. I have to get the webinar report so I know who all was here. So I'll do that, and you can be on the lookout for an email from me, or you can watch Twitter to see who won. So there you go. So thank you. Thanks, Jarian. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for having us. Thank you, everybody, for attending today.
All right.
Everybody free time.
Oh, it's just me now.
As it should be, Stephanie. The spotlight's on you. Take it.
Oh, great. Well, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and look forward to seeing you on another CUGC webinar or a meeting or at an Excel event, excuse me, again soon. All right, thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.